You may telephone from here by Algernon Blackwood. She sent the servant to bed at 10:30 and sat up in the flat alone. I'll let my cousin in, she explained. She may be rather late. She read, knitted, began a letter, poked the fire, and examined her husband's photographs on the mantelpiece. But most of the time she looked about her nervously, sometimes going to the door to listen, sometimes lifting the corner of the blind to look out upon the lights of North Kensington, struggling with the blackness. The fog was thicker than ever. A rumble of traffic feeling its way floated up to her from below. But at last the doorbell rang sharply, and she ran to let in the cousin who had promised to spend the 2 nights with her during her husband's absence in Paris. They kissed. Both began talking at once. "I thought you were never coming, Sybil. The play was out late, and the fog's bad. I sent on my box this afternoon on purpose. It came safely, and your room's quite ready. I do hope you'll manage all right without a maid. Oh, I'm so glad you've come, though. Foolish little country mouse. Oh, it's not that so much, though I admit that London still terrifies me at night, rather. But this is the first time he's been away. I suppose. I know, dear. I understand perfectly." The cousin was brisk and cheerful. "You feel lonely, of course." They kissed again. "Just unhook me, will you?" she added, "and I'll get into my dressing gown, and then we'll be cozy over the fire." "I saw him off at the Victoria at 8:45, said the little wife when the operation was over. "New Haven and Dieppe?" "Yes. He gets to Paris at 7 in the morning. He promised to telephone the first thing." "You expensive little monkey." "Why? It's 10 shillings for 3 minutes, or something like that, and you have to go to the GPO, or the Mansion House, or some such place, I believe." "I thought it was the usual long-distance thing direct here to the flat. He never told me all that." "Probably you didn't give him a chance." They laughed and went on chatting, with feet on the fender and skirts tucked up. The cousin lit her second cigarette. It was after midnight. "I'm afraid I'm not the least bit sleepy," said the wife apologetically. "Nor am I, dear. For once the play excited me." She began to describe it vigorously. Halfway through the recital, the telephone sounded in the hall. It tinkled faintly, but gave no proper ring. The other started. "There it is again. It's always doing that ever since Harry put it in a week ago. I don't quite like it." She spoke in a hushed voice. The cousin looked at her curiously. "Oh, you mustn't mind that," she laughed with a reassuring manner. "It's a little way they have when the line gets out of order. You're not used to playing the telephone game yet. You should call up the exchange and complain. Always complain. In this world, if you want—" "There it goes again," interrupted her friend nervously. "Oh, I do wish it would stop. It's so like someone standing out there in the hall and trying to talk." The cousin jumped. They went into the hall together, and the experienced one briskly rang up the exchange and asked if there was anybody trying to get through. With fine indignation she complained that no one in the flat could sleep for the noise. After a brief conversation she turned, receiver in hand, to her companion. "The operator says he's very sorry, but your line's a bit troublesome tonight for some reason. Got mixed or something. He can't understand it. Advises you to leave the receiver unhooked till the morning. Then it can't possibly ring, you see." They left the receiver swinging and went back to the fire. "I'm sorry I'm such a timid donkey," the wife said, laughing a little. "But I'm not used to it yet. There's no telephone at the farm, you know." She turned with a sudden start, as though she heard the bell again. "And tonight," she added, in a lower voice, though with an obvious effort at self-control, "for some reason or another, I feel uncomfortable, rather excited. Queer, I think." "How queer?" I don't know exactly. Almost as if there were someone else in the flat. Someone besides ourselves and the servant, I mean." The cousin moved abruptly. She switched on the electric lights in the wall beside her. "Yes, but it's only the imagination, really," she said with decision. "It's natural enough. It's the fog, and the strangeness of London after the loneliness of your farm life, and your husband being away, and all that. Once you analyze these queer feelings, they always go. Hark! Exclaimed the wife under her breath. Wasn't that a step in the passage? She sat bolt upright, her face pale, her eyes very bright. They listened for a moment. The night was utterly still about them. Rubbish! Cried the cousin loudly. It was my foot knocking the fender like this. Look! She repeated the sound vigorously. I do believe it was, the other said, only half convinced. But it is queer. You know, I feel exactly as though someone had come into the flat. Quite recently, since you came. I mean, just before the tinkling began, in fact. Come, come, laughed the cousin. You'll give us both the jumps. At 1 o'clock in the morning, it's easy to imagine anything. You'll be hearing elephants on the stairs next. She looked sharply about her. Let's brew our chocolate and get to bed, she added. We shall sleep like tops. 1 o'clock already. Then Harry's halfway across by now, said the wife, smiling at her friend's language. But I'm so glad, oh, so glad you're here, she added. And I think it's most awfully sweet of you to give up a comfy big house. They kissed again and laughed. Soon afterward, having scalded their throats with hot chocolate, they went to bed. It simply can't ring now, remarked the cousin triumphantly as they passed the receiver dangling mid-air. That's a relief, her friend said. I feel less nervous, really. I'm too ashamed of myself for anything. Fog's clearing too, Sybil added, peering for a moment through the narrow window beside the front door. An hour later the little flat was still as a grave. No sound of traffic was heard. Even the tinkling of the telephone seemed a whole 24 hours away, when suddenly it began again. First with soft little tentative noises, very faint, troubled, hurried, buried almost out of the hearing inside the box, then louder and louder, with sharp jerks, finally with a challenging and alarming peal, and the wife who had kept her door open, without pretense of sleep, heard it from the very beginning. In a moment she found herself in the passage, and Sybil, wakened by her cry, was at her heels. They turned up the lights and stood facing one another. The hall smelt, as things only smell at night, cold, musty. What's the matter? You frightened me. I heard you scream. The telephone's ringing again, violently, the wife whispered, pale to the lips. Don't you hear it? This time there's someone there. Really? The cousin stared blankly at her. The laugh choked in her throat. I hear nothing, she said defiantly, yet without confidence in her voice. Besides, the thing's still disconnected. It can't ring. Look. She pointed to the hanging receiver, motionless against the wall. You're white as a ghost, though, she added, coming quickly forward. Her friend moved suddenly to the instrument and picked up the receiver. It's someone for me, she said, with tear in her eyes. It's someone who wants to talk to me. Oh, hark, hark how it rings. Her voice shook. She placed the little disc to her ear and waited while her friend stood by and stared in amazement, uncertain what to do. She had heard no ringing. You, Harry, whispered the wife into the telephone, with brief intervals of silence for the replies. You? But how in the world so soon? Yes, I can just hear, but very faintly. Miles and miles away your voice sounds, what? A wonderful journey. And sooner than you expected? Not in Paris. Where then? Oh, my darling boy. No, I don't quite hear. I can't catch it. I don't understand. The pain of the sea is nothing, is what? You know nothing of what? The cousin came boldly up. She took her arm. But, child, there's no one there, bless you. You're dreaming. You're in a fever or something. Hush, for God's sake, hush. She held up a hand. In her face and eyes was an expression of indescribable fear, love, bewilderment. Her body swayed a little, leaning against the wall. Hush, I hear him still. But oh, miles and miles away. He says he's been trying for hours to find me. First he tried my brain direct, and then, oh, he says he may not get back again to me. Only, he can't understand, can't explain why. The cold, Oh, the awful cold keeps his lips from. Oh! She screamed aloud as she flung the receiver down and dropped a heap upon the floor. I don't understand. It's death. Death. And the collision in the channel that night, as they learned in due course, occurred a few minutes after 1 o'clock, while Harry himself, who remained unconscious for several hours after the boat picked him up, could only remember that his last desire, as the wave caught him, was an intense wish to communicate with his wife and tell her what had happened. The next thing he knew, he was opening his eyes in the Dieppe Hotel. And the other curious detail was furnished by the man who came to repair the telephone next day. At the exchange, he declared, the wire from midnight till nearly 3 in the morning had emitted sparks and flashes of light no one had been able to account for in any usual manner. Queer, said the man to himself after tinkering and tapping for 10 minutes. But there's nothing wrong with it at this end. It's the subscriber, more likely. It usually is. Accessory Before the Fact by Algernon Blackwood. At the moorland crossroads, Martin stood examining the signpost for several minutes, in some bewilderment. The names on the 4 arms were not what he expected. Distances were not given, and his map, he concluded, with impatience, must be hopelessly out of date. Spreading it against the post, he stooped to study it more closely. The wind blew the corners flapping against his face. The small print was almost indecipherable in the fading light. It appeared, however, as well as he could make out, that 2 miles back he must have taken the wrong turn. He remembered that turning. The path had looked inviting. He had hesitated a moment, then followed it, caught by the usual lure of walkers that it might prove a shortcut. The shortcut snares as old as human nature. For some minutes he studied the signpost and map alternatively. Dusk was falling, and his knapsack had grown heavy. He could not make the 2 guides tally, however, and a feeling of uncertainty crept over his mind. He felt oddly baffled, frustrated. His thought grew thick. Decision was most difficult. I'm muddled, he thought. I must be tired. As at length he chose the most likely arm. Sooner or later it will bring me to an inn, though not the one I intended. He accepted his walker's luck and started briskly. The arm read, "Over Literacy Hill," in small fine letters that danced and shifted every time he looked at them, but the name was not discoverable on the map. It was, however, inviting, like the shortcut. A similar impulse again directed his choice, only this time it seemed more insistent, almost urgent, and he became aware then of the exceeding loneliness of the country about him. The road for 100 yards went straight, then curved like a white river running into space. The deep blue-green of heather lined the banks, spreading upwards through the twilight, and occasional small pines stood solitary here and there, all unexplained. The curious adjective, having made its appearance, haunted him. So many things that afternoon were similarly unexplained, and the shortcut, the darkened map, the names of the signpost, his own erratic impulses, and the growing strange confusion that crept upon his spirit. The entire countryside needed explanation, though perhaps interpretation was the truer word. Those little lonely trees had made him see it. Why had he lost his way so easily? Why did he suffer vague impressions to influence his direction? Why was he here? Exactly here. And why did he go now over Literacy Hill? Then, by a green field that shone like a thought of daylight amid the darkness of the moor, he saw a figure lying in the grass. It was a blot upon the landscape, a mere huddled patch of dirty rags, yet with a certain horrid picturesqueness too, and his mind, though his German was of the schoolroom order, at once picked out the German equivalents as against the English. Lump and lumpen flashed across his brain, most oddly. They seemed in that moment right, and so expressive, almost like onomatopoeia words, as if they were possible of sight. Neither Rags nor Rascal would have fitted what he saw. The adequate description was in German. Here was a clue tossed up by the part of him that did not reason, but it seems he missed it, and the next minute the tramp rose to a sitting posture and asked the time of the evening. In German, he asked it, and Martin, answering without a second's hesitation, gave it, also in German, halb sieben, 6:30. The instinctive guess was accurate. A glance at his watch when he looked at it a moment later proved it. He heard the man say with the covert insolence of tramps, "Thank you, much obliged." For Martin had not shown his watch. Another intuition subconsciously obeyed. He quickened his pace along that lonely road, a curious jumble of thoughts and feelings surging through him. He had somehow known the question would come, and come in German, yet it flustered and dismayed him. Another thing that had also flustered and dismayed him, he had expected it in the same queer fashion. It was right, for when the ragged brown thing rose to ask the question, a part of it remained lying on the grass. Another brown dirty thing. There were two tramps, and he saw both faces clearly. Behind the untidy beards, below the old slouch hats, he caught the look of unpleasant, clever faces that watched him closely while he passed. The eyes followed him. For a second he looked straight into those eyes, so he could not fail to know them. And he understood, quite horridly, that both faces were too sleek, refined, and cunning for those of ordinary tramps. The men were not really tramps at all. They were disguised. How covertly they watched me, was his thought as he hurried along the darkening road, aware in dead earnestness now of the loneliness and desolation of the moorland all about him. Uneasy and distressed, he increased his pace. Midway in thinking what an unnecessarily clanking noise his nailed boots made upon the hard white road, there came upon him with a rush together the company of these things that haunted him as unexplained. They brought a single, definite message, that all this business was not really meant for him at all, and hence his confusion and bewilderment that he had intruded into someone else's scenery, and was trespassing upon another's map of life. By some wrong inner turning, he had interpolated his person into a group of foreign forces which operated in the little world of someone else. Unwittingly, somewhere, he had crossed the threshold and was now fairly in. A trespasser, an eavesdropper, a peeping Tom. He was listening, peeping, overhearing things that he had no right to know because they were intended for another. Like a ship at sea, he was intercepting wireless messages he could not properly interpret because his receiver was not accurately tuned in to their reception. And more, these messages were warnings. Then fear dropped upon him like the night. He was caught in a net of delicate, deep forces he could not manage, knowing neither their origin nor purpose. He had walked into some huge psychic trap, elaborately planned and baited, yet calculated for another than himself. Something had lured him in, something in the landscape and the time of day, his mood. Owing to some undiscovered weakness in himself, he had been easily caught. His fear slipped easily into terror. What happened next happened with such speed and concentration that it all seemed crammed into a moment. At once and in a heap it happened. It was quite inevitable. Down the white road to meet him a man came swaying from side to side in drunkenness, quite obviously feigned, a tramp, and while Martin made room for him to pass, the lurch changed in a second to attack, and the fellow was upon him. The blow was sudden and terrific, yet even while it fell, Martin was aware that behind him rushed a second man, who caught his legs from under him and bore him with a thud and crashed to the ground. Blows rained then. He saw a gleam of something shining, A sudden deadly nausea plunged him into utter weakness where resistance was impossible. Something of fire entered his throat, and from his mouth poured a thick, sweet thing that choked him. The world sank far away into darkness. Yet through all the horror and confusion ran the trail of two clear thoughts. He realized that the first tramp had sneaked at a fast double through the heather, and so come down to meet him, and that something heavy was torn from fastenings that clipped it tight and close beneath his clothes against his body. Abruptly then the darkness lifted, passed utterly away. He found himself peering into the map against the signpost. The wind was flapping the corners against his cheek, and he was poring over names that he now saw quite clear. Upon the arms of the signpost above were those he had expected to find, and the map recorded them quite faithfully. All was accurate, and as it should be. He read the name of the village he had meant to make. It was plainly visible in the dusk, 2 miles the distance given. Bewildered, shaken, unable to think of anything, he stuffed the map into his pocket unfolded, and hurried forward like a man who had just awakened from an awful dream that had compressed into a single second all the detailed misery of some prolonged, oppressive nightmare. He broke into a steady trot that soon became a run. The perspiration poured from him. His legs felt weak, and his breath was difficult to manage. He was only conscious of the overpowering desire to get away as fast as possible from the signpost at the crossroads where the dreadful vision had flashed upon him. For Martin, accountant on a holiday, had never dreamed of any world of psychic possibilities. The entire thing was torture. It was worse than a cooked balance of the books that some conspiracy of clerks and directors proved at his innocent door. He raced as though the countryside ran crying at his heels, and always still with him the incredible conviction that none of this was really meant for himself at all. He had overheard the secrets of another. He had taken the warning for another into himself, and so altered its direction. He had thereby prevented its right delivery. It all shocked him beyond words. It dislocated the machinery of his just and accurate soul. The warning was intended for another, who could not, would not, receive it now. The physical exertion, however, brought at length a more comfortable reaction and some measure of composure. With the lights in sight, he slowed down and entered the village at a reasonable pace. The inn was reached, a bedroom inspected and engaged, and supper ordered with the solid comfort of a large bass, to satisfy an unholy thirst, and complete the restoration of balance. The unusual sensations largely passed away, and the odd feeling that anything in his simple, wholesome world required explanation was no longer present. Still, with the vague uneasiness about him, though actual fear quite gone, he went into the bar to smoke an after-supper pipe and chat with the natives, as his pleasure was upon a holiday, and so saw 2 men leaning upon the counter at the far end with their backs toward him. He saw their faces instantly in the glass, and the pipe nearly slip from between his teeth. Clean-shaven, sleek, clever faces, and he caught a word or two as they talked over their drinks. German words. Well-dressed they were, both men with nothing about them calling for particular attention. They might have been 2 tourists holiday-making like himself, in tweeds and walking boots, and they presently paid for their drinks and went out. He never saw them face to face at all, but this sweat broke out afresh all over him. A feverish rush of heat and ice together ran about his body. Beyond question he recognized the 2 tramps, this time not disguised. Not yet disguised. He remained in his corner without moving, puffing violently at an extinguished pipe, gripped helplessly by the return of that first vile terror. It came to him with an absolute clarity of certainty that it was not with himself they had to do, these men, and further, that he had no right in the world to interfere. He had no locus standi at all. It would be immoral, even if the opportunity came. And the opportunity he felt would come. He had been an eavesdropper, and he'd come upon some private information, even a secret kind, that he had no right to make use of, even that good might come, even to save life. He sat on in his corner, terrified and silent, waiting for the thing that should happen next. But night came without explanation. Nothing happened. He slept soundly. There was no other guest at the inn but an elderly man, apparently a tourist like himself. He wore gold-rimmed glasses, and in the morning Martin overheard him asking the landlord what direction he should take for Literacy Hill. His teeth began then to chatter, and weakness came into his knees. "You turn left at the crossroads," Martin broke in before the landlord could reply. "You'll see a signpost that's about 2 miles from here, and after that it's a matter of 4 miles more." How in the world did he know? Flashed horribly through him. "I'm going that way myself," he was saying next. "I'll go with you for a bit if you don't mind." The words came out impulsively and ill-considered. Of their own accord they came, for his own direction was exactly opposite. He didn't want the man to go alone. The stranger, however, easily evaded his offer of companionship. He thanked him with the remark that he was starting later in the day. They were standing all three beside the horse trough in front of the inn, when at that very moment a tramp, slouching along the road, looked up and asked the time of day, and it was the man with the gold-rimmed glasses who told him. "Thank you, much obliged," the tramp replied, passing on with his slow, slouching gait, while the landlord, a talkative fellow, proceeded to remark on the number of Germans that lived in England and were ready to swell the Teutonic invasion, which he, for his part, deemed imminent. But Martin heard it not. Before he had gone a mile upon his way, he went into the woods to fight his conscience all alone. His feebleness, his cowardice, were surely criminal. Real anguish tortured him. A dozen times he decided to go back upon his steps, and a dozen times the singular authority that whispered he had no right to interfere prevented him. How could he act upon knowledge gained by eavesdropping? How interfere in the private business of another's hidden life merely because he had overheard, as at the telephone, its secret dangers? Some inner confusion prevented straight thinking altogether. The stranger would merely think him mad. He had no fact to go on. He smothered 100 impulses and finally went on his way, with a shaking, troubled heart. The last 2 days of his holiday were ruined by doubts and questions and alarms, all justified later when he read of the murder of a tourist upon Literacy Hill. The man wore gold-rimmed glasses and carried in a belt about his person a large sum of money. His throat was cut, and the police were hard upon the trail of a mysterious pair of tramps, said to be Germans. That Damned Thing by Ambrose Bierce. By the light of a tallow candle, which had been placed on one end of a rough table, a man was reading something written in a book. It was an old account book, greatly worn, and the writing was not, apparently, very legible, for the man sometimes held the page close to the flame of the candle to get a stronger light upon it. The shadow of the book would then throw into obscurity a half of the room, darkening a number of faces and figures, for besides the reader, 8 other men were present. 7 of them sat against the rough log walls, silent and motionless, and, the room being small, not very far from the table. By extending an arm, any one of them could have touched the 8th man, who lay on the table, face upward, partly covered by a sheet, his arms at his sides. He was dead. The man with the book was not reading aloud, and no one spoke. All seemed to be waiting for something to occur. The dead man only was without expectation. From the blank darkness outside came in, through the aperture that served for a window, all the ever unfamiliar noises of night in the wilderness, the long nameless note of a distant coyote, the stilly pulsing trill of tireless insects in trees, strange cries of night birds, so different from those of the birds of day, the drone of great blundering beetles, and all that mysterious chorus of small sounds that seem always to have been but half heard when they have suddenly ceased, as if conscious of an indiscretion. But nothing of all this was noted in that company. Its members were not overmuch addicted to idle interests in matters of no practical importance. That was obvious in every line of their rugged faces, obvious even in the dim light of the single candle. They were evidently men of the vicinity, farmers and woodmen. The person reading was a trifle different. One would have said of him that he was of the world, albeit there was that in his attire which attested to a certain fellowship with the organisms of his environment. His coat would hardly have passed muster in San Francisco. His footwear was not of urban origin, and the hat that lay by him on the floor, he was the only one uncovered, was such that if one had considered it as an article of mere personal adornment, he would have been missing its meaning. In countenance, the man was rather prepossessing, with just a hint of sternness, though he may have assumed or cultivated as appropriate to one in authority, for he was a coroner. It was by virtue of his office that he had possession of the book in which he was reading. It had been found among the dead man's effects, in his cabin where the inquest was now taking place. When the coroner had finished reading, he put the book into his breast pocket. At that moment the door was pushed open and a young man entered. He, clearly, was not of mountain birth and breeding. He was clad as those who dwell in cities. His clothing was dusty, however, as from travel. He had, in fact, been riding hard to attend the inquest. The coroner nodded. No one else greeted him. "We have waited for you," said the coroner. "It is necessary to have done with this business tonight." The young man smiled. "I am sorry to have kept you," he said. "I went away, not to evade your summons, but to post to my newspaper an account of what I suppose I am called back to relate." The coroner smiled. "The account that you posted to your newspaper," he said, "differs, probably, than that which you will give here, under oath." "That," replied the other, rather hotly, with a visible flush, "is as you choose. I used manifold paper, and have a copy of what I sent. It was not written as news, for it is incredible, but as fiction. It may go as part of my testimony, under oath. But you say it's incredible. That is nothing to you, sir, if I also swear that it's true." The coroner was apparently not greatly affected by the young man's manifest resentment. He was silent for some moments, his eyes on the floor. The men about the sides of the cabin talked in whispers, but seldom withdrew their gaze from the face of the corpse. Presently the coroner lifted his eyes and said, "We will resume the inquest." The men removed their hats. The witness was sworn. "What's your name?" the coroner asked. "William Harker." "Age?" 27. "You knew the deceased, Hugh Morgan?" "Yes." "You were with him when he died?" "Near him." "How did that happen? Your presence, I mean." "I was visiting him at this place to shoot and fish. A part of my purpose, however, was to study him, and his odd, solitary way of life. He seemed a good model for a character in fiction. I sometimes write stories." "I sometimes read them." "Thank you. Stories in general, not yours." Some of the jurors laughed. Against a somber background, humor shows highlights. Soldiers in the intervals of battle laugh easily, and a jest in the death chamber conquers by surprise. "Relate the circumstances of this man's death," said the coroner. "You may use any notes or memoranda that you please." The witness understood. Pulling a manuscript from his breast pocket, he held it near the candle, and turning the leaves till he found the passage he wanted, began to read. 2. The sun had hardly risen when we left the house. We were looking for quail, each with a shotgun, but we only had one dog. Morgan said that our best ground was beyond a certain ridge that he pointed out, and we crossed it by a trail through the chaparral. On the other side was comparatively level ground, thickly covered with wild oats. As we emerged from the chaparral, Morgan was but a few yards in advance. Suddenly, we heard, at a little distance to our right, and partly in front, a noise as of some animal thrashing about in the bushes which we could see were violently agitated. "We've started a deer," said. "I wish we'd brought a rifle." Morgan, who had stopped and was intently watching the agitated chaparral, said nothing, but had cocked both barrels of his gun and was holding it in readiness to aim. I thought him a trifle excited, which surprised me, for he had a reputation for exceptional coolness, even in moments of sudden and imminent peril. "Oh, come," I said, "you're not going to fill up a deer with quail shot, are you?" Still he did not reply, but, catching the side of his face as he turned slightly toward me, I was struck by the pallor of it. Then I understood that we had serious business on hand, and my first conjecture was that we had jumped a grizzly. I advanced to Morgan's side, cocking my piece as I moved. The bushes were now quiet, and the sounds had ceased, but Morgan was as attentive to the place as before. "What is it? What the devil is it?" I asked. "That damned thing," he replied, without turning his head. His voice was husky and unnatural. He trembled visibly. I was about to speak further when I observed the wild oats near the place of the disturbance moving in the most inexplicable way. I can hardly describe it. It seemed as if stirred by a streak of wind, which not only bent it, but pressed it down, crushed it so that it did not rise, and this movement was slowly prolonging itself directly toward us. Nothing that I had ever seen had affected me so strangely as this unfamiliar and unaccountable phenomenon. Yet I am unable to recall any sense of fear. I remember, and tell it here because singularly enough, I recollected it then, that once in looking carelessly out of an open window, I momentarily mistook a small tree close at hand for one of a group of larger trees at a little distance away. It looked the same size as the others, but, being more distinctly and sharply defined in mass and detail, seemed out of harmony with them. It was a mere falsification of the law of aerial perspective, but it startled, almost terrified me. We so rely on the orderly operation of familiar natural laws that any seeming suspension of them is noted as a menace to our safety, a warning of unthinkable calamity. So now the apparently causeless movement in the herbage, and the slow, undeviating approach of the line of disturbance were distinctly disquieting. My companion actually appeared frightened, and I could hardly credit my senses when I saw him suddenly throw his gun to his shoulders and fire both barrels at the agitated grass. Before the smoke of the discharge had cleared away, I heard a loud, savage cry, a scream like that of a wild animal, and flinging his gun upon the ground, Morgan sprang away and ran swiftly from the spot. At that same instant I was thrown violently to the ground by the impact of something unseen in the smoke, some soft, heavy substance that seemed thrown against me with great force. Before I could get upon my feet and recover my gun, which seems to have been struck from my hands, I heard Morgan crying as if in mortal agony. Mingling with his cries were such hoarse, savage sounds as one hears from fighting dogs. Inexpressibly terrified, I struggled to my feet and looked in the direction of Morgan's retreat. And may heaven in mercy spare me from another sight like that. At a distance of less than 30 yards was my friend, down on one knee, his head thrown back at a frightful angle, hatless, his long hair in disorder, and his whole body in violent movement from side to side, backward and forward. His right arm was lifted and seemed to lack the hand. At least I could see none. The other arm was invisible. At times, as my memory now reports this extraordinary scene, I could discern but a part of his body. It was as if he had been partly blotted out. I cannot otherwise express it. Then a shifting of his position would bring it all into view again. All this must have occurred within a few seconds, yet in that time Morgan assumed all the postures of a determined wrestler vanquished by a superior weight and strength. I saw nothing but him, and him not always distinctly, During the entire incident, his shouts and curses were heard, as if through an enveloping roar of such sounds of rage and fury as I have never heard come from the throat of man or brute. For a moment I only stood irresolute. Then, throwing down my gun, I ran forward to my friend's assistance. I had a vague belief that he was suffering from a fit or some form of convulsion. Before I could reach his side, he was down and quiet. All sounds had ceased. But, with a feeling of such terror as even these awful events had not inspired, I now saw the same mysterious movement of the wild oats prolonging itself from the trampled area about the prostrate man toward the edge of a wood. It was only when it had reached the wood that I was able to withdraw my eyes and look at my companion. He was dead. 3. The coroner rose from his seat and stood behind the dead man. Lifting an edge of the sheet, he pulled it away, exposing the entire body, altogether naked, and showing in the candlelight a clay-like yellow. It had, however, broad maculations of bluish black, obviously caused by extravasated blood from the contusions. The chest and sides looked as if they had been beaten with a bludgeon. There were dreadful lacerations. The skin was torn in strips and shreds. The coroner moved round to the end of the table and undid a silk handkerchief which had been passed under the chin and knotted on the top of the head. When the handkerchief was drawn away, it exposed what had been the throat. Some of the jurors who had risen to get a better view repented their curiosity and turned away their faces. Witness Harker went to the open window and leaned out across the sill, faint and sick. Dropping the handkerchief upon the dead man's neck, the coroner stepped to an angle of the room, and from a pile of clothing produced one garment after another, each of which he held up for a moment for inspection. All were torn and stiff with blood. The jurors did not make a closer inspection. They seemed rather uninterested. They had, in truth, seen all this before, the only thing that was new to them being Harker's testimony. "Gentlemen," the coroner said, "we have no more evidence, I think. Your duty has been already explained to you. If there's nothing you wish to ask, you may go outside and consider your verdict." The foreman rose, a tall bearded man of 60, coarsely clad. "I should like to ask one question, Mr. Coroner," he said. "What asylum did this your last witness escape from?" "Mr. Harker," said the coroner, gravely and tranquilly, "from what asylum did you last escape?" Harker flushed crimson again, but said nothing, and the 7 jurors rose and solemnly filed out of the cabin. "If you've done insulting me, sir," said Harker, as soon as he and the officer were left alone with the dead man, "I suppose I'm at liberty to go?" "Yes." Harker started to leave, but paused, with one hand on the door latch. The habit of his profession was strong in him, stronger than his sense of personal dignity. He turned about and said, "The book that you have there, I recognized as Morgan's diary. You seemed greatly interested in it. You read in it while I was testifying. May I see it? The public would—" "The book will cut no figure in this matter," replied the official, slipping it into his coat pocket. "All the entries in it were made before the writer's death." As Harker passed out of the house, the jury re-entered and stood about the table on which the now covered corpse showed under the sheet with sharp definition. The foreman seated himself near the candle, produced from his breast pocket a pencil and scrap of paper, and wrote rather laboriously the following verdict, which with various degrees of effort all signed: "We, the jury, do find that the remains come to their death at the hands of a mountain lion, but some of us thinks, all the same, they had fits." 4. In the diary of the late Hugh Morgan are certain interesting entries having, possibly, a scientific value as suggestions. At the inquest upon his body, the book was not put in evidence. Possibly the coroner thought it not worth while to confuse the jury. The date of the first of the entries mentioned cannot be ascertained. The upper part of the leaf is torn away, part of the entry remaining is as follows. Would run in a half circle, keeping his head turned always toward the center, and again he would stand, barking furiously. At last he ran away into the brush as fast as he could go. I thought at first that he had gone mad, but on returning to the house found no other alteration in his manner than what was obviously due to fear of punishment. Can a dog see with his nose? Do odors impress some olfactory center with the images of the thing emitting them? September 2. Looking at the stars last night as they rose above the crest of the ridge east of the house, I observed them successively disappear from left to right. Each was eclipsed but an instant, and only a few at the same time, but along the length of the ridge, all that were within a degree or two of the crest were blotted out. It was as if something had passed along between me and them, but I could not see it, and the stars were not thick enough to define its outline. Ugh, I do not like this. Several weeks' entries are missing, 3 leaves being torn from the book. September 27. It has been about here again. I find evidences of its presence every day. I watched again all of last night, in the same cover, gun in hand, double charged with buckshot. In the morning, the fresh footprints were there, as before. Yet I would have sworn that I did not sleep. Indeed, I hardly sleep at all. It's terrible, insupportable. If these amazing experiences are real, I shall go mad. If they are fanciful, I am mad already. October 3. I shall not go. It shall not drive me away. No, this is my house, my land. God hates a coward. October 5. I can stand it no longer. I've invited Harker to pass a few weeks with me. He has a level head. I can judge from his manner if he thinks me mad. October 7. I have the solution of the problem. It came to me last night, suddenly, as by revelation. How simple, how terribly simple. There are sounds that we cannot hear, at either end of the scale are notes that stir no chord of that imperfect instrument, the human ear. They are too high or too grave. I have observed a flock of blackbirds occupying an entire treetop, the treetops of several trees, and all in full song. Suddenly, in a moment, at absolutely the same instant, all spring into the air and fly away. How? They could not all see one another. Whole treetops intervened. At no point could a leader have been visible to all. There must have been a signal of warning or command, high and shrill above the din, but by me unheard. I have observed, too, the same simultaneous flight, when all were silent, among not only blackbirds but other birds, quail, for example, widely separated by bushes, even on opposite sides of a hill. It is known to seamen that a school of whales basking or sporting on the surface of the ocean, miles apart, with the convexity of the earth between them, will sometimes dive at the same instant, all gone out of sight in a moment. The signal has been sounded, too grave for the ear of the sailor at the masthead and his comrades on deck, who nevertheless feel its vibrations in the ship, as the stones of a cathedral are stirred by the bass of the organ. As with sounds, so with colors. At each end of the solar spectrum, the chemist can detect the presence of what are known as actinic rays. They represent colors, integral colors in the composition of light, which we are unable to discern. The human eye is an imperfect instrument. Its range is but a few octaves of the real chromatic scale. I'm not mad. There are colors that we cannot see. And God help me, the damned thing is of such a color.
The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce. In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence, than, impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed farther westward, to encounter new perils and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been of those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs, surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile nor speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land which if needful he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravage wrought by the axe. Apparently, the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door and directly opposite a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not. And none knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long full beard were white, his gray lustreless eyes sunken, his face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden bearer. I never saw him; these particulars I learned from my grandfather, from whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living near by in that early day. One day Murlock was found in his cabin, dead. It was not a time and place for coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told and should remember. I know only that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting indeed the circumstance that many years afterward, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost which every well-informed boy thereabout knew haunted the spot. But there is an earlier chapter, that supplied by my grandfather. When Murlock built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle meanwhile his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, as was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name. Of her charms of mind and person tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubt. But God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life. For what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health, but at the end of the third day she fell into unconsciousness and so passed away, apparently with never a gleam of returning reason. From what we know of a nature like his, we may venture to sketch in some of the details of the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others which he did correctly were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, "I shall have to make the coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her, when she is no longer in sight. But now she is dead, of course, but it is all right. It must be all right somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem." He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck. That knowledge would come later, and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest shrillish notes, from others the low grave chords that throb recurrent like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to a keener life, to another as the blow of a bludgeon which in crushing benumbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground than that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face into them, tearless yet unutterably weary. At that moment came in through the open window a long wailing sound like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening woods. But the man did not move. Again and nearer than before sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast, perhaps it was a dream, for Murlock was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke and, lifting his head from his arms, intently listened. He knew not why. There in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see he knew not what. His senses were all alert, his breath was suspended, his blood had stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. Who, what had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied that he heard, a light soft step. Another. Sounds as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the darkness through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know, yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she were there. His throat was powerless, his arms and hands were like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharply as nearly to overthrow him, and at the same instant he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling occurred and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murlock had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table. Nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness incites to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murlock sprang to the wall, with a little groping seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with a vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman toward the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there was darkness blacker than before, and silence, and when he returned to consciousness the sun was high and the wood vocal with songs of birds. The body lay near the window where the beast had left it when frightened away by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder, the limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear.
A bizarre and fantastic story is The Phantom Drug by A. W. Kapfer. This document, written in a clear, bold hand, was found in the burned ruins of an old insane asylum. The records of this institution had been saved, and upon investigation it was found that an eminent drug analyst was confined within its walls for one of the most horrible crimes ever recorded. He was judged and found insane after telling, as his defense, a fantastic story which was interpreted as a maniac's delusion. After reading his story, which coincides so well with the known facts, one cannot help but wonder. It's night again, one of those threatening, misty nights that you see in dreams. I'm afraid of it. It turns like a mockery to goad my memory to greater torture. It was on a night much like this that it happened. That horrible experience that gives my mind no rest. That fear that gives shadows ghostly forms and lends an added terror to the scream of an insane inmate. They put me in a madhouse because they judged me insane. Me, whose mentality is so inexpressibly superior to those that judged me mentally unbalanced. They would not believe the facts I told them, said my story was a fabrication of an unsound mind, as an alibi for the horrible crime I had committed. I swore on my honor that I had told the truth, but even my friends refused to believe me. So it is with little hope of winning your credulity that I leave this written document. But here are the facts. I was at work in my laboratory analyzing some drugs that I had received in a new consignment from India. A tube, which contained a phosphorescent liquid, attracted my attention, and I read the note my collector had sent with it. He stated that it was supposed to have the power of transforming the mind of a human into the body of an animal, a superstition which the natives of the inner jungle firmly believed. They claimed it is compounded from the brains of freshly slain animals, each brain containing an amount of this substance relative to its size. I naturally scoffed at the claims for this drug, but decided to test it on one of my laboratory animals so that I could place it in its proper category. I injected a small amount into the system of a rabbit and watched closely the reaction. For a minute, it was motionless, except for the natural movements of breathing. Then its eyelids closed slowly until they were completely shut, and it appeared in a deep lethargy. For half a minute more, there appeared no change. Then its eyes flickered open, and I looked, not into the timid eyes of a rabbit, but those of a scared animal. With a sudden leap, it leapt for the laboratory light, which was suspended by a chain from the ceiling. Its paws, however, were unfitted to grip the chain or the sloping reflector, and it fell to the floor, only to spring frantically at the curtain in a vain attempt to climb it. Another leap sent it to the top of the cabinet, where it upset several bottles, which fell to the tiled floor and smashed. This aroused me from my stupor, and I endeavored to catch it. I might as well have tried to catch its shadow. From cabinet to mantel, from mantel to curtain, curtain to shelf, leaving a trail of spilled and broken bottles in its wake. As it sprang about, strange, squeaking barks came from its throat. Perspiring and out of wind, I gave up the chase, picked up the overturned chair, and sat down to ponder the matter out. I observed the rabbit's actions closely. Now it was on the shelf, looking at its short stump of a tail, and chattering excitedly. Then it rubbed its ears, and seemed startled at their length. I wondered, what was the explanation of this? It flew around like a monkey. A monkey, that was it. The drug made animals act like monkeys. Then the claim of the natives was true, and the drug did have the power of performing a transition. I wondered if the drug always had the same result, and decided to test it again on a white mouse that I took from another cage. I carefully injected a small amount into its bloodstream. After a minute had expired, during which it made no move, it began to twitch about. The blood was pounding in my temples, and my eyes were glued to its quivering form. Slowly, it roused from its stupor, and then stood on its hind legs, while it flapped the front ones about by its side. "What the deuce?" I began. Then I understood. The drug affected each animal differently, depending on the amount of the dose. As I arrived at this conclusion, I noticed the rabbit was hopping about in its natural way, all trace of its former erratic movements gone. Never before in my experience had any drug such a startling effect on the brain as to give it the complete characteristics of a different animal. My old and dearest friend, Rodney Caleb, was living with me, and I went to his room to tell him what had occurred. He was lying on the bed, covered by a heavy blanket, which did not entirely conceal the hulking form, once the proud possessor of enormous strength, now robbed by sickness and old age. He was 20 years older than I. He liked to talk of the days when his prowess was commented upon, where strength and courage counted. His voice still held some of its old timbre as he greeted me and noticed my excitement. "Hello," he said. "Something interesting happen?" With eager enthusiasm, I detailed the effects the drug had had on the rabbit and the mouse. I could tell by the expression on his face that he was intensely interested, but when I finished, he lay back on his pillow as if in deep thought. "Doc," he said quietly, "I think that at last I am going to have my wish fulfilled." I looked at him uncomprehendingly. "You know," he said, growing excited, "you know how I've longed to have my old strength back again, or at least to be active for a time. Well, there you have a substance that can perform that miracle." "What do you mean?" I gasped. "Why can't I take some of that drug," he reasoned, "and control the body of some animal for a while?" "Rodney, you are crazy," I cried aghast. "I will not consent to your doing such an insensate thing. It would mean your death within a few minutes. Can you imagine yourself as a monkey, hopping and swinging about, with that old body of yours? It could never stand the strain." "You forget something," he smiled. "What?" I asked. "My mind would no longer control this body, but that of some active and healthy animal." "I should say not," I began, then stopped and reasoned the matter out. The rabbit had been controlled by a monkey's mind. What happened to the rabbit's mind? It was only logical to suppose that they had been exchanged, and that some monkey in far-off India had been hopping about like a rabbit during the transition. "It is possible," I admitted, "that you would have the control of another body. But you forget that your body would be controlled by the animal's mind. That would be far more risky, as was proved by the rabbit's antics in the laboratory." "You can take care of that," he argued, "by giving me a potion to numb the motor areas of my brain, and by giving me a sleeping powder. Then, no matter what impulse is aroused, it cannot be carried into action." I pondered his words carefully, and had to admit to myself that the reasoning was plausible. Rodney pleaded his cause with desperate earnestness. "Here I am, an old man, chained to a bed for the rest of my life, a year or so at most. Life holds little attraction for me, handicapped as I am. My body is weak, but the spirit of adventure is still strong within me. Surely you cannot deny me this favor, if not to gratify the wish of an old man, then on the claim of our friendship." "I have but one thing left to say," I replied, "and that is, if you take some of this drug, then so will I." Rodney hesitated in involving me in his rash wish. "It is not necessary for you to do so," he said. "You are healthy, and in the name of our profession, you owe the world a service. Nothing claims me." "Nevertheless, the arrangement stands," I said. "Do you think I could ever bear to have anything happen to you through this enterprise without my sharing it? Never. We have stood together in all the things in the past, and will continue to do so until the end." Rodney placed his hand on mine. Neither of us spoke for a few minutes, but we felt the bond of friendship more closely than ever before. "I can't ask you to risk it," he said huskily, and tried to hide the disappointment that his voice betrayed. "And I cannot refuse your wish," I replied. "Besides, it is in a way my duty to undergo an experience that may prove valuable in research. I must admit that I felt thrilled by the prospect of this adventure too. When shall we try it?" "I'm ready now," he replied. "What preparations are necessary?" "Hardly any," I said. "I'll go down to the laboratory and get the sedatives and a hypodermic needle for this drug. I may as well bring my safety kit along." Before I locked the back door, I glanced out into the night. The air was surcharged and oppressive, and the uncanny stillness that precedes a storm sent a chilling premonition over me. I locked the door, gathered the articles I needed, and returned to the bedroom. "An electrical storm is coming," I said. Rodney did not answer. His eyes were on the tube containing the phosphorescent drug. He was breathing faster and became excited and impatient. "Better quiet down a bit, Rod," I admonished. My own heart was pumping strangely, and the air seemed exceedingly warm. I thought it best to hide my perturbation from him, however. An unexpected crash of thunder made our nerves jump. "We're as nervous as a couple of kids on their first pirate expedition," laughed Rod. His voice was high-pitched and taut. I mixed a sedative and a sleeping potion for him, and a strong mixture for myself. These we drank. Then I took off my coat, bared my left arm, and bade Rod roll up his pajama sleeve. "We shall not feel the effects for a minute or two," I told him, "but by that time the potion we drank will start its work. Just lie quiet." I forced my hand to be steady as I injected the drug into his arm, then hastily refilled the needle chamber from the tube and emptied it into my own arm. Rodney had put his hand by mine as I lay down beside him, and I clasped it fervently. A drowsiness crept over me as the seconds slipped by. Then something snapped, and I knew no more. An unfamiliar atmosphere surrounded me when my mind began to function again. Slowly, the haze wore away, and I stirred restlessly as strange impressions flooded my brain. I was amongst a heavy growth of trees, rank grass, and brush. My nose felt peculiar to me. Then I cried out in wonder. It was not a faint ejaculation that came from my throat, however, but a roar, a volume of sound that made the very earth tremble, and with good cause, for I, or rather my mind, was embodied in an elephant. My nose, it was now a trunk. I became intoxicated with the thought of the strength I now possessed, seized a tree with my trunk, and with a mighty tug, pulled its roots from the ground and hurled it aside. My cry of satisfaction was a boom that rolled like a peal of thunder. A low growl sounded behind me, and I swung my huge hulk quickly around. A tiger lay crouching in the undergrowth. I raised my trunk threateningly and stamped angrily, but the beast did not move. Then I looked into its eyes and understood. It was Rodney. He had possession of a tiger's body. He was overjoyed at my recognizing him, and although we could not talk to each other, We showed our pleasure plainly enough. He gloried in the agility and strength that were now his, and took prodigious leaps and flips in a small clearing. Finally, tired and winded from his play, he came to me and rubbed his back against my leg, purring like an immense cat. With a flip of my trunk, I swung him on my back and raced through the jungle for miles. A river cut its way through this wilderness, and we drank our fill. A gallon of water seemed but a cupful to my stupendous thirst. I was amusing myself by squirting water on Rodney, when a roar came from a distance, accompanied by heavy crashings. We faced the direction of the disturbance and waited breathlessly. Over the top of the waving jungle grass there appeared the head of an angry elephant. That its temper was up was all too plain. Its ears stuck out from its head like huge fans, and its upraised trunk blasted forth a challenge as it charged along. I looked anxiously at Rodney. The light of battle was in his eyes, and I knew that he would be a formidable ally. It was too late to flee. My opponent was too close, and the river was a barrier which, if I tried to cross, would give my adversary the advantage of a firmer footing. My temper was aroused also, and as it was not my own body that was at stake, I did not fear the coming conflict. The huge elephant facing me charged, and I met him halfway. Two locomotives crashing together would not have made that glade tremble more than it did when we met. My enemy gave a scream of fear and pain when we parted, and I soon saw the reason why. Rodney had waited until we were locked, then launched himself at the throat of my rival. He had sunk his teeth deep in its tough hide, and was tearing the flesh from its shoulder and chest with his bared claws. All this I had seen in an instant, and as the monster turned on Rodney, I charged it from the side, driving both tusks deep in it. Almost at the same instant, Rodney severed its jugular vein. The elephant trembled, swayed, and toppled to the ground. I was unhurt, except for an aching head, the result of the first onslaught, but Rodney had not fared so well. As we turned from our fallen adversary, I noticed that one of his legs had been crushed. The light of victory was in his eyes, however, and he seemed happy despite the pain he must have been suffering. It was then that I noticed a change coming over me, a sort of drowsiness. At first, I thought it was due to the exertion I had just gone through, but as its effects became more marked and insistent, I realized with a tremor of terror what it really was. The elephant's mind was trying to throw my own out of possession of its body. I glanced at Rodney apprehensively to see if he were undergoing the same change. He was still in complete control. Then the truth dawned on me. The immense bulk I had been dominating had absorbed the power of the drug faster than the body Rodney controlled. I hurried to his side and tried to make him understand that he should crawl into the jungle and hide until the effect of the drug had worn off. It was no use. The more I stamped and raged, the more his eyes smiled at me as though he thought I was trying to show him how pleased I was at our victory. More and more insistent and powerful did the elephant's mind become. It began to take control of its body and fixed its eyes with a baleful glare on Rodney's recumbent form. I struggled desperately to wrest control from that conquering mind, but in vain. The drug's force was ebbing fast. One last warning I managed to blast out, and Rodney faced me. Horror of horrors! He thought I was calling him. Slowly and painfully he crept toward me. My thoughts became dim, and I struggled, as if in a dream, to conquer again the huge bulk he was approaching, but it was too late. The monster I had once controlled was in almost complete possession now, and I was but an unwilling spectator, viewing things through a veil that grew steadily heavier. When Rodney was but a few feet away, the body under me reared in the air. A flash of fear showed in Rodney's eyes as he realized the awful truth, and as his shrill scream rent the air, I was swallowed into blackness. I don't know how long I lay in a daze in Rodney's bedroom. Consciousness came back slowly. As events crowded themselves into my mind, I felt for Rodney's hand. It was not by my side. I sat up in bed, weak and trembling all over. At first, I did not see him. Then, I screamed in livid terror. Rodney lay beside the bed, every bone in his body broken, as though something weighing several tons had crushed him.